Okay, you've got your rough boards in hand and now you're ready to mill them straight and smooth.
Woodworking is mostly about making rectangular shapes and then joining them together. So if you can make accurate, straight, flat rectangles, you're halfway there.
In this episode, we're going to show you how to use a specific set of tools in a specific order to get perfectly straight, perfectly square lumber, the foundation of solid woodworking.
We know we have enough wood in the right thicknesses, and now we need to find out which parts are coming from where.
And be sure to use the cut list that comes as part of this video series to get started.
I use a piece of chalk or a lumber crayon to just mark out the pieces in these rough boards.
Now we're going to build two tables, but we'll just take you through the process for one of them.
We'll get our rails from this board here. And here are our four legs. And we'll cut this really nice board into 3 pieces to get our tabletop. And then we'll cut up this board to make the shelf.
Now here's a really important tip. You're going to want to cut your boards to rough size before you try to flatten them. They're going to be a lot easier and safer to handle that way, and you'll minimize the warping and crookedness of each board.
Yeah, you don't want to flatten this board all in one pass. It's really warped and you'll lose a lot of wood trying to straighten it out. Another thing you don't want to do is cut rough pieces on the table saw. When logs are cut out of the tree, they're wet inside, and so they're put into a kiln to dry slowly.
And in there they always warp, at least a little bit. And that warped board can actually rock and roll on your table saw, pinching that blade and even kicking the board back at you.
The best tools for roughing pieces to size are the jigsaw and the bandsaw. Even if the pieces continue to move and twist while you're cutting them, and they will, you'll be perfectly safe with these tools.
Asa just cuts to his rough lines. He cross-cuts them with a jigsaw or a miter saw, and then rips them lengthwise with the bandsaw. You could use a jigsaw for this also. Lots of options here.
If you have a piece with crooked grain, here's a little trick. Just draw a straight line right along the grain lines, and then bandsaw or jigsaw along that line. After that, you can proceed as normal.
Now that we've got all our pieces roughed out, we're ready to hit the serious milling machines. And the show starts at the jointer. Now this is a 6-inch model, which is the most affordable type for the beginner.
A lot of people think a planer flattens boards, but it doesn't. If a board goes in like a banana, it's going to come right out like a banana too. You need a jointer to flatten boards. By the way, if you don't have one, you can make a special sled for your planer, but the jointer is easiest.
So that's where we'll start. We'll set our jointer to make a light cut, and if our boards are a little bit warped, we'll make sure that the cupped side is down for best results. We'll also pay attention to the edge grain. We want to make sure that this grain is running uphill as it goes over that cutter head. You'll get less tear out that way.
You concentrate your pressure on the infeed side, then over the cutter head, and then onto the outfeed side. And use push pads to keep your hands out of harm's way. The back one should have a little hook on the end to help you push. And Ed makes a little mark to keep track of the faces that he's milled. Now while he's at the jointer, he'll do an edge too. First, he'll check that the fence is square. And then the same principles apply. Check the grain direction, and if the board is cupped, run that concave edge on the bottom. But this time, he's going to run the face that he just milled up flat against the fence.
Now we've got two adjacent surfaces flat and square to one another, and so the rest is easy since these are going to be the reference surfaces for our next steps. Let's head over to the planer.
The first thing you want to do at the planer is check the thickness of your board to make sure you're not going to take too heavy a cut. Most planers have a little gauge that helps with setup. Also, the flat jointed face goes down on the planer's bed. And you want to check the grain direction again, remembering that the cutter head is on the top side this time. So we want to run this board through like this.
Asa will just take passes, lowering the cutter head each time until he reaches the thickness he wants. Notice how he's flipping the boards at some point to try to take off a similar amount of wood from each side. That will help to prevent warpage later on. Remember that the shelf is only a 1/2 inch thick, so you have some extra planing to do on those 3 boards. Now he'll head over to the table saw to cut the boards to width, which finishes off that last rough edge of each piece. The keys are to run the straight edge of the board against the rip fence and use a push stick to keep your hands away from the blade. Asa also has the table saw's splitter in place, which stops the piece from pivoting away from the rip fence and getting onto the back of the blade, which can cause a violent kickback. The splitter prevents that and lets you work with no worries. For very narrow cuts, you might not be able to get the push stick past the blade guard. In these cases, it's okay to take off the guard, but be sure to keep the splitter in place and of course use your push stick.
The final step in the milling process is to cut the pieces to length, squaring each end. We're going to use the miter gauge for that. I've attached this extra board to it for more support.
Asa will make a clean, square cut on one end of each piece first, again marking that end to keep track of it. Now here's another great benefit of the extra long fence he added. He can clamp a simple stop block to it, which means every piece will come out exactly the same length. Notice how the blade actually cuts right into the fence. That does two good things. The fence prevents chip out at the back edge of the cut, and it also pushes the waste piece clear of the blade. At this point, you only want to cut the rail pieces and the legs to final length. We'll leave the shelf and tabletop pieces long for now. We'll explain later on. So that's it. Perfect rectangles. That's fine woodworking.
In the next episode, we'll taper the legs.